household, actually Lot's daughter, marries one of the princes of Sodom, and she notices a man starving to death on her way to the well every day, and she secretly gives him food. In giving him food, she's detected and she's condemned to death. She's burned, and her last scream, there's just a quick line in the Bible that says, the scream of Sodom was heard by God, and he came down to see what was up. And the scream of Sodom was this woman being killed for helping strangers. This is a deeply embedded idea for the Jewish community. So then what happens? Okay, so Abraham, the strangers tell him he's 99, his wife's 89, she's going to have a baby. He laughs, she laughs. It seems to be a funny joke, and that's why Isaac is named Isaac, which in Hebrew is Yitzchak, which commemorates the idea of laughter. It turns out not to be such a big joke. The three strangers go on the road. And as they leave, God himself metaphorically snaps his fingers, or her fingers, and says, shall I not tell Abraham that which I am about to do? For I have loved him, I have loved Abraham and Sarah, because they will teach their children and their household that will follow them to follow the way of God by doing justice and righteousness. This is the closest thing that the Bible has to a mission statement for the Jewish people. I have loved them, and God never has to, if you're God, you don't have to explain yourself. This is actually the only time in the Bible where God explains himself. I have loved them because they will teach their children and their household that will follow them to follow the way of God by doing justice and righteousness. He says, I'm afraid Abraham, I just told Abraham I'm going to be his partner, and tomorrow I'm going to destroy Sodom, and I haven't told him, so I better go back and let him know what's going on, so he'll know I'm a good partner. So he goes back and he tells Abraham he's going to destroy Sodom. So who knows what happens next? Abraham argues with God. Bear in mind that later on in the same chapter, when God tells him to sacrifice his own child, there's no argument. But when he tells him that he's going to destroy complete strangers in Sodom, Abraham argues. And he says, if there are 50 righteous people, would you destroy it? And he says, will the judge of the whole world not do justice? How can you destroy the innocent with the wicked? And the discussion goes on until it gets down to 10. And then there's a very interesting phrase. Abraham says, if there are 10 righteous people, betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city, doesn't use this any other place, betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city, will you destroy the city? And God says no. If there are 10 righteous people, betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city, I won't destroy the city. So the rabbis say, what does this betoch ha'ir mean, in the midst of the city? Why is that added? And the reason is that if there are righteous people in a city, and they isolate themselves, and they are not involved in the civic life of the city, and they're not involved in improving the lives of the people in the city, then there's no way they will ever save the city. There's no way that they will ever redeem the city. On the other hand, if there are 10 righteous people, betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city, involved in the city, engaged in the city, then they have the opportunity to save themselves and the city. Sodom fails. There are no 10 righteous people who are capable of being engaged in the city and saving the city. And the end of the story, you already know. God overturns the city in the name of the woman who was killed for doing justice. So now that's just one story. Obviously, the story is repeated in the story of the Exodus very, very clearly. We need to remember the plight of the stranger. Of course, the story is repeated inside Christianity as well. But I take that as being important. Now, let me say this. You can retell these stories any way you want. You can make anything you want out of a story from the Bible or the Quran or the New Testament or any of that. So we have a responsibility as a Jewish community to tell the story the way we want the story to be told, in a way that we think is going to be redemptive both of the Jewish people and of humankind. I'm interested in hearing what Jim has to say. Thank you.
Well, before I speak, I want to say something, which is what my father said to me when I was 12. Took me outside, back of the house, and said, I'm going to give you the one rule that I can give you about your life. Here is one thing you must never do as long as you live. Never, ever follow Barry Schrage to a platform and give a speech. I intend to actually take my theme from the title behind me, say a few words about the meaning of urban community, but I would like to presume to think that what I'm going to really try to do is give you the broader context from within which Barry just spoke so movingly about the city. So, pay attention. I'm going to write these words. Sure. I'm not talking yet. Just remember. Barry told you I'm a Catholic, and I'm proving it with these Latin words. Does this work? You can hear me? Okay, so this is the beginning. Over here, I'm not sure when that was. Billion years, 2 billion years. This is today, all right? This is, call it 2 million BCE. Archaeologists have actually discovered a rudimentary tool that suggested that Homo erectus, who comes into being somewhere in here, we don't know, Homo erectus, the upright walker, at a certain point becomes Homo habilis, the tool maker. And what's interesting is that about 2 million years ago, a rudimentary tool was found, and about 1 million years ago, a rudimentary tool was found. They can carbon date these tools now, and they know how old these implements are. And the first thing to say, the astounding thing that these scientists noticed, and I would put in parentheses here, I am no scientist, and I'm engaging what scientists would call baseless speculation, also known as BS, perhaps. A phrase I had reference to in the column I published in the Globe this week. But the thing that they noticed between 2 million and 1 million about the tool was that they hadn't learned much. The tool was shaped more or less the way it had been shaped 1 million years before. Homo habilis was not evolving very quickly. In fact, the whole human story of evolution, the thing that's amazing about it is how slow it was. And from the year, let's put a couple of other dates on the record here. Between 100,000 and say 35,000 BCE, the hunter-gatherers became capable of reflection on their own experience in such a way that they could leave records of it. The cave paintings. The oldest cave paintings that have been discovered date to something like 75,000 or 80,000 BCE, and the most recent to about 35,000 BCE. And again, what they are astounded by is how over 50,000 years, the techniques of cave painting in France, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia. Cave painting was happening around the globe. The techniques of painting did not evolve very much across 50,000 years. It's very striking. So let's call this 35,000 BCE. Again, not much happens. But then something happens that absolutely generates an explosion in the pace of human evolution. And we can tell you when it was. Somewhere around the year 10,000 BCE. It was when the hunter-gatherer peoples, remember, first they're gatherers of some kind, because the discovery of the hunt, the ability of these creatures to actually go after an animal and kill it, changes them. It's the beginning of, probably the beginning of what we would recognize as our ancestor humans, Homo sapiens. Because the hunt required cooperation, it required communication, it required planning, it required the division of labor. And the next thing you know, these creatures who had been just accidental gatherers, picking things up and eating them, suddenly they can plan and they can cooperate and they are becoming human beings. But they're still in this very slow period of evolution because of the very things they can't do, the very things that Barry was just talking about. Because they're moving constantly. They're chasing herds. The herds are leading them. How did they get from somewhere around Kenya to North America, to every part of the globe? They chased animals. These creatures were on the move. And they had no, therefore, cultural memory. They were Homo sapiens. They knew something, but they didn't have a lot to do with what they knew. And some genius, over generations, it was a number of geniuses, probably females, some genius discovered that these gathered fruits that we eat, if you just leave them in the ground when they fall, they sprout a plant that produces more of them. And we say it's probably a female who makes this discovery because the females were the ones in the hunter-gatherer cultures who were in charge of the campsite, the home base. The males were out after the beasts. At a certain point, at this point, agriculture is discovered. Homo sapiens learns how to plant and harvest food. And guess what happens? They have a reason to stop moving. Now we know a lot more about this than we do about that. We know where this happened. And it's not incidental to what we're talking about, that it happened in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the region out of which the Bible comes. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the glorious, this is the evolution of the human species after about the year 10,000 BCE. So you get this kind of static movement through the centuries, and then this explosion. And on the dates, let's see. So let's call that about 10,000 to 9,000 BCE, agriculture, which is the control of planting, which gives these people a reason to stop. And suddenly, they are settled together, and certain things begin to quickly happen. This is, of course, the beginning of the city. This is what human evolution is like without a city. And once they were settled, there was good news and bad news. The good news was they could control their environment to the extent that they could actually overcome the radical insecurity of the hunter-gatherer life. They could predict their sources of food. They could plan for it. They began to notice things that they'd had no reason to notice before. The movement of the heavenly bodies became important because suddenly they needed to understand the working of light. They needed to understand the working of tides, of the way the waters flowed. And we have the beginning of science, what we call science, the beginning of reflection on experience. So the good news is that people settled begin to have something that hunter-gatherers never had, which is space within which to think about something else besides the next meal. Think about what it is that we're experiencing. And it's at this point, I would argue, I'm not saying this scientifically now, but Barry gives me permission to say I'm saying this theologically. This is when Homo sapiens becomes something else. Homo sapiens sapiens. This is the great event in who we are. We are not the creatures who know. We are the creatures who know that we know. And that's what happens in cities. The institution that is an emblem of that breakthrough is the university. We're sitting in the middle of it. What are we doing here? We're not knowing. We're knowing that we know. Dogs know. Anybody have a dog? Your dog knows, right? Does your dog know that he or she knows? We don't think so. We think that the human person is the only creature in existence, as far as we know, that knows it knows. And that is my first point about the meaning of urban community. And look what happened. Look what happened once we developed this capacity. From the discovery of agriculture to the discovery of the internet. In a minute, on the scale of time. Now let's take note of some other moments of significance. Call this 10,000. In about 3,000, these creatures who have now, because they're settled, discovered their story, they're able to actually tell each other a story about what they've been through. And beginning about maybe 4,000 BCE or 3,000 BCE, these people have discover a way of making the story last longer than one generation, or they liberate themselves from the limits of the oral tradition, and they learn how to write, which is the beginning of what we call history. The past becomes present to us, and we begin to learn from it. That's, call it 3,500 BCE, for just to give it a date. And look what else happens. In 2000, there's a guy named Abraham. In 1000 BCE, there's a guy named David. Interesting that this is all in the Fertile Crescent, by the way. Unbelievable creativity as a result of this discovery there. Scientists tell us, by the way, that agriculture was almost simultaneously, on the scale of this time, discovered at other fertile river delta places in China, perhaps India, and perhaps in some later period, North America, what we would call Central or South America. The hunter-gatherers become farmers, they become settled people, they become city dwellers. The oldest extant city in the world is Jericho, which dates to about, 8,000 BCE? No accident that it's there. So Abraham is about 2,000. David, I put it 1,000. Somewhere around 800 BCE, between 800 and 700 BCE, people begin to respond big time to the other aspect about life in the city. I said there was good news and bad news. What's the bad news? The bad news is that farming requires mass labor, hard work that nobody volunteers for. And agriculture, the discovery of agriculture, brings with it what every city we know is dealing with to this day, which is a class system, a small, privileged elite who dominate a mass, oppressed majority who are forced to do the work that nobody wants to do. Sound familiar? It's at least 10, 11, 12,000 years old. It comes with the city. And here's what's interesting. Human beings, knowing that they know, immediately begin to object to it. No, they do. The elite are capable of objecting to it. The philosophers who have time to think about this system are capable of objecting to it. Homo sapiens sapiens, to know that you know, includes the qualities that we recognize as self-criticism, reckoning with the moral meaning of what we are and what we're doing. And that's what's interesting. I said this is Abraham, 2,000. This is David, 1,000. In the years between 800 and 700, we have the invention, to use a crude word, of the Bible. And what is the Bible? The Bible is an argument against the bad news of the city. The Bible is unique in that it tells the story from the point of view of the one who's oppressed. And that's between 700 and 800 BCE. And basically, the story of the human race since the invention of the city is the story of an argument with an argument enabled by the good news of the city against the bad news of the city. And that's the subject of this course. So let's talk about it.
Very good. And we're right on time. I told you that this would be a special, special evening, and I think you can see it in both of our guests. Let's take about a 5-10 minute break. No more than that. Let's come back. We've got lots of questions, lots of discussion. We're only up to 3000 BC. We have a while to go.
By the way, we believe there might be a second women's bathroom on the second floor in case there's a long line.
I love that. I love that.
John, what do you want me to do with this? What would you like me to bring?
Do you have a key? Would you be able to bring it and bring my key back? Or
Yeah, or like I might be.
we could just put it in the, well, I have to bring a